All right, hi everyone, and welcome to the third and last day of ARP. We're really happy to welcome to come back together for more wonderful programming today. And to kick it off, we'll be discussing the symposium titled "Where Are Race, Culture, Ethnicity, and Personality Research?" And the symposium will be chaired by Syed. So Moin, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Kelsey. Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to see so many awesome people that I know well and other people who I don't know at all. It's great that you all came out on this Friday to have this conversation. Thanks to the organizing committee for the invitation to organize this symposium and for such a dynamite program. I think it's been really great. I was on vacation the first part of it, so I've been catching up with the recordings, but in general, it's been really excellent. And so I have watched or attended the other discussion sessions associated with the symposia, and prepared a few questions that I did not feel had really been discussed or covered in those sessions. So I was trying not to have a redundant discussion as much as possible. And I shared those questions with the other presenters ahead of time, just so that they could get the wheels turning a little bit. But I also want to hear from all of you. So I'm hoping we can have a nice, vibrant discussion here. We also don't need to sort of stick to the discussion questions that I came up with. I have start with one and kind of we'll just see where things go from there. But just a couple of communication rules. Many of you have your cameras on, so please, you're welcome to have them on or off, whatever you're most comfortable with. If you want to participate in the discussion, you can raise your hand. I will try to monitor that as best as possible. You can put the question in the chat. You can also send a private chat just to me if you want to ask a question, but you don't want to see the whole group. You don't want the whole group to see your question. I will not reveal your name if you send it via private chat, so feel free to do that as a way to ask questions as well. And then I'll paste these questions if I ask one in the chat so you can see it, because they're kind of long. They're more like thoughts. I like comments, questions that are more of a comment. I think that's totally fine personally. Questions are not the only way that we interact with one another scholarly. We also make comments, right? So after watching all the talks and thinking and reflecting about them, I thought it'd be useful to take a step back, a big step back a little bit. I felt like a strong theme across all the talks is for the need for us to examine and reflect on the underlying philosophies and assumptions that we bring to our work. So not just in terms of our design, so not just talking about recruiting diverse samples or including different variables or anything like that. So not narrowly about methods and practices, but more broadly, how our background and our biases inform our selection of research questions, our methodological choices, and how we interpret the data. And I feel like this isn't examined so often by personality researchers, and generally the field tends to embody kind of a sort of post-positivism, and that this philosophy is largely unaware, or it could be aware, but it's a product of passive socialization more than an intentional choice. And this certainly was true for my background and schooling, in that I was never sort of presented with an array of different models for how to do science and said, why don't you weigh the merits of these and see which one makes the most sense for the questions that you're interested in? No, I was socialized into a particular way of doing things. I think that's the way most of us were. So I guess my question there in that, I should, one more comment about that, is I do see this as a major diversity issue, because the more that you reflect on your assumptions and what's sort of underlying the choices you make, the more you see the limits to what you're doing, and the more you see how non-inclusive what you're doing is. I thought Radhika's talk in particular was a good example of sort of bringing that reflection, showing how it can impact the work. So I guess my question is here is how do we encourage this intentional choice field-wide when most of us have not done it, and really it's not part of our training programs? So how do we build this in so that we are being more thoughtful about those underlying assumptions? So I know that's a really big question, but I kind of wanted to start broad, and that's why I shared it with the panelists beforehand. So I'll see which of them wants to jump in and start sort of freestyling on that. And then hopefully some of you also have some thoughts and comments about that. And I'll paste the whole thing in the chat. Manisha, I knew you'd be ready to go.
We'll see if I make sense. So I think one of the things that is in a way most surprising to me about that passive socialization in our training is how much we learn to sort of do personality science by kind of looking around at what personality science seems to be and sort of modeling ourselves after one or the other strand that we find. And I know that for me, there are a number of things that contributed to where my own intellectual trajectory has gone. But I think within the world of personality science, there are two pieces that have kind of shaped me towards entertaining radical ideas. Whether or not I practice them is a different question. But one is that I think I've always been more interested in personality processes than in structure. And as soon as you look at processes, you can do that in a kind of variable focused way where you're sort of looking at one variable influencing another, but often that kind of process work is informed by looking at what people actually do. So it sort of takes you into this realm where some of the things you are doing methodologically, even if you don't get to write about them in the final paper that you submit, those things are not quite like what you're being trained to do, right? So you're sort of like watching people talk on the playground, or, I have really spent a lot of time inappropriately spying on my children's conversations. And that sort of informs some of the questions that I posed. And I think that takes you a little bit out of that. It makes you think harder about, like, why is it that the thing I can publish in Journal of Personality looks like this, when these things I am doing behind the scenes that inform my work look somewhat different. So I think that was that's one spark for myself. And I think the other is that in looking at narrative aspects of personality, I started to have questions that could not be answered by the methods I had been taught were the right things to do. So I started to have questions like, we all engage in harmful behavior towards others. We all are on the receiving end of harmful behavior from other people. There's no way to be a social person and not be hurt and hurt others. And so I started to wonder, like, how do we organize those two sets of experiences together? And this turns out to be something where it's really hard to do the kind of quantitative work that I was trained to do. And so that kind of sent me into qualitative work. And again, that starts to make you think about the assumptions that you're bringing to what you do. So those were sort of sparks for me about how that bigger reflection starts for people. And maybe it's symposia like this one that you put together that starts it for others. I don't know.
That's great. Thank you. I should add a qualifier too. I think my question and comment sort of assume that it's necessarily a good thing that we reflect that we should be doing this, that we need to do it, that in some way it'll change our research and our way of thinking about personality. And so I just want to make sure to open up space if anyone wants to disagree with that, you certainly can.
Two of the words that keep popping up in my mind, and again, this probably will not be incredibly coherent, but one is thinking about awareness, awareness either from what others around you are currently doing, seeing how they are doing something that is purposely different, structured differently, setting up some of the assumptions on what we're expecting from folks coming from a different sort of set of philosophies or set of viewpoints, and being very purposeful about that, or hinting a little bit at what Manisha was bringing up, finding areas where the work you're already doing, it's not sufficient, finding that there's some sort of gap, there's some sort of mismatch between what you're trying to accomplish or what you think your work should be accomplishing and what you're actually running into when you're collecting data, when you're reaching out to participants, so on and so forth. That awareness, however that emerges, whether that's from conference opportunities, whether that's from mentoring, whether that's from the data more closely, I think is one key element for sort of bringing to folks' attention that they do need to at least reconsider what's going well, what makes sense, are the approaches that have been most comfortable and most common to them so far, are those going to work well, and is there a reason to reconsider that? The other kind of big word that comes up just from some of the points that you were bringing up, Moin, is this idea of being sort of intentional or motivated perhaps to Two, be open to challenging some of your approaches, some of the things that have been really safe so far that feel like they work really well, and that have been tried and true as far as you know it, and being willing and comfortable sort of putting them out there and possibly losing a little bit of some of that, finding that something else may make a little bit more sense, even if it's not what you've been trained in, even if it's not the easiest approach, or even if it's something that's a little bit foreign to you, as far as some of the methodologies, some of the theories that you'd be and bringing to the table at that point. Thinking of those two elements, I don't know how best to sort of encourage the opportunities for that awareness, or maybe instances where folks could have some of those things brought to their attention aside from some of these more structured opportunities, and then thinking about other organic opportunities that may arise, again, as people are doing more research, as they're getting more experiences with colleagues, with mentors, with students. And even further, thinking about how you could get folks comfortable and excited about or motivated to really want to reconsider, try to think very, very deeply about their current positions, their current holdings, and what's working well for them, what makes the most sense for what's going on in the field more broadly, and where there might be some opportunities or maybe even a need to reconsider, to make some adjustments. Those are daunting tasks and big asks at times for folks. So I'm not sure how best those sort of steps for thinking of our current work as investigators, thinking of the students we're working with, thinking of the studies we're hoping to continue designing and running, how best to keep that moving. But those are the two big domains, and I'm sure there are many others that really stood out just from some of the conversations up to this point. What's going to help bring to folks' attention that there could be some mismatches, some needs to reconsider or go further. How could folks most feel motivated or comfortable doing so, and taking that reflection, possibly incorporating some structured and systematic changes going forward as well.
Thanks, Jordan. I think on that theme of sort of major adjustments is related to what's going on in the chat, although I didn't see the last comment. There are several comments in the chat about the idea of adding positionality statements to articles. And I think, that's become more and more popular. It's been done in a lot of qualitative traditions for a long time, but there's been more and more calls for that. And of course, major resistance to it too, because it really threatens sort of the mainstream approach to psychological research as being objective and sort of value neutral. So I guess maybe if anyone wants to elaborate on comments they put in the chat, or say anything about pros or cons about positionality statements, what value would they bring? Why should we be skeptical of them?
Can I say something? Maybe it's not exactly directly related to that, but I do think that so this symposium, and as well as positionality statements, kind of are the first step in making people think about it, so that you can move from what you were saying, the kind of non-reflective to a more intentional choice. And I think this can help. So, and I also think that getting a lot of perspectives, obviously, like Jordan was saying, is really important. But I think that sometimes even people who might be able to have diverse perspective might not be willing to do so out of a desire to fit in. And so, for example, I'm not claiming I'm the most diverse person ever, but like, as my background of being from Romania, my main goal, that's why I was saying earlier that Monisha's talk made me tear up, because there was a quote in there that said, your other cultures are not just failed forms of your own culture. So what's interesting for me is that in order to, out of my desire to fit in when I moved at 22 to the US, out of my desire to fit in and really just want to fit in and do everything right, part of that process was actually kind of putting down some of my Romanian culture and considering that as more of a failed culture. So I constantly make comments, and now this has become very salient with having a baby recently, because I have all these decisions like, do I teach him Romanian, or is that going to make him worse in English in school in the first few years? And I'm just realizing now and reflecting with all these things, and in the context of this symposium, how much out of my desire of fitting into the US has stripped away and made me consider my other culture a complete failure. So I think having these discussions kind of gives the courage as well to people who are from diverse backgrounds. And again, I'm not talking about me, this is just like the example I have, to actually bring their different perspectives. And having positionality statements could be a first step in just making you think about it. So yeah, but then the question is, like, I wouldn't know where to begin. Like, I haven't been schooled in Romania. I don't know what the perspective is of like Romanian psychology. So like, I wouldn't know where to begin, like maybe looking into other fields and getting the perspectives of people who have already done the work of trying to bring in their background. That could be a way, and just reading more from other fields. But like, where do I find a good list of readings? So okay, that's all I had to say.
See a hand up from J.O. Wide.
Oh, it's Randa, yes.
Oh, it's right. I didn't see that. You had not.
Sorry, that's my weird Wake Forest username. So, I just want to quickly validate everything that Radhika said, both on the professional and personal front, since I imagine we've had similar experiences there. And I did want to say a little bit about, the culture personality, because I was someone who didn't get trained in a personality lab, right? I was doing sort of cultural perspectives and well-being in Marty Seligman's lab, and I only sort of started identifying more as a personality psychologist once I moved into my postdoc and faculty position. So, one thing that I thought when I was listening to your talk more is that a lot of these perspectives are like pretty salient in developmental psychology or in other subfields. And it's interesting to me, right, that if you are trained as a personality psychologist, it seems you're not exposed so much to these perspectives. And I don't know why it is. I mean, some people have spoken about how, the way we teach personality is outdated, or we still haven't quite gotten over the person situation debates. The whole, like, our whole culture is sort of dominated by sort of this sort of almost this like reactionary perspective to what happened like 50 years ago. But I wonder, right, as someone who hasn't been trained in a personality lab, right, to what extent part of the issue might be the training PhD students and graduate students receive, and also maybe the culture around that experience.
Yeah, those are some really great points. And, the culture, and I always want to be careful, developmental psychology is not perfect by any means on any of these kinds of things, but does a good job on some of these topics. But it hasn't always been that way, right? The culture changed over time. It changed as it diversified. And one of the, like, if you look at the leadership in some of the major developmental organizations like SRA, SRCD, they're populated heavily by folks who sort of, they grew up in immigrant contexts or ethnic minority contexts in the US, and we're trying to understand their youth a little bit better. I mean, this is led to positionality, right? My good friend and former mentor, lifelong mentor, Linda Zhuang, studies, family conflict and immigrant families. That's where she started. She did that because she wanted to figure out, why was I not getting along with my parents when I was an adolescent, right? And then realized, oh, I can do this, scientifically, and do studies about this. And so you saw a huge wave of folks doing that in, kind of, I'm sort of part of that generation too, more on the tail end of it. But you saw a big move in the 90s and 2000s of folks trying to sort of realize they could draw from their experiences and investigate them scientifically. And the way developmental research is set up, focusing on different contexts and relationships and things like that, I think it was better suited to that kind of work. Whereas personality, mainstream personality, at least a little bit less so.
So I agree with those points, and I think that's possible that sometimes, obviously that the labs play a role, but I think also kind of going back to Olivia's talk at the beginning of the conference, it's also reviewers and journals, because I always felt that the labs I was in were very open to like integrating other fields or other perspectives and all of that, but it's more like we'd include something from another field and then the reviews would come back being like, take that out. So I just think that sometimes it's more, maybe the field more broadly is maybe a little bit afraid of integrating different perspectives, although I've also seen it done successfully. So maybe it's just a matter of luck, but just having the awareness is really important, and the different perspectives.
I'm I wonder too, I mean, I just wonder, like, when I think about developmental psychology, I think about the attachment tradition, which really started with work in very different, I mean, Bowlby was working in I think sub-Saharan Africa, if I'm not totally mistaken. And so there were some, early, not unproblematic, but early roots in trying to think about things in more than one space. And I wonder if in personality, there are things in the history of personality research that may create wrong turns, or if there are things in the history of personality research that have been sort of forgotten or overlooked, that also give some roots to a more integrative and a more broader perspective, a perspective that brings in culture.
There's a question in the chat about what we mean by a positionality statement. Thank you for confessing your cluelessness. That's always helpful. Okay, so somebody else might be able to explain it better than I can, but the idea is that we always have some relation, some personal relation to the research that we're doing. That's true for everybody, right? Everybody does. And we all are bringing our biases and assumptions and what have you to that work. But in a lot of work, especially in psychology, that's all invisible, right? You read an article, you have no idea what the research team's biases are that were informing that research. And so the idea behind positionality statement is being clear about those backgrounds. Now, what's included in it, I think that's where it drifts a little bit, and it can get kind of diffuse about, well, what is relevant, right? What should you include? But people talk about the importance of talking about race and ethnicity and gender and socioeconomic status, your relation to the participants themselves. If you have any kind of personal insights that might be related to the nature of the topic or the sample. Does anyone want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, I can add just a little bit. I haven't done one for a more quantitative paper, but I did recently collaborate with some colleagues on a more qualitative paper. We did have a brief positionality statement, really just briefly describing the general sort of background characteristics of each of the contributing authors. So, what our ranks were. We had some students, we had some faculty members, racial and ethnic backgrounds, genders of our authors. We were focusing on a specific sample of Black mothers and teens. So we talked about why we were interested in questions regarding that sample and who was actually interacting with those families and how they're interacting with those families. As we then went on to then describe how we were interpreting some of the behaviors from those families to give a better sense on why we were looking at certain behaviors or how we might have been making some assumptions about what we were seeing coming from those families. So we provide just a brief sort of backdrop that would give a little bit of sense, even if you were focusing very heavily or exclusively on quantitative analyses, some backdrop that might help explain why you're making some of the assumptions or when it comes to the discussion and so on.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let me move to the other question that I proposed because it's a little more concrete. Well, a little more concrete, not that much more concrete, but looking a little bit more forward. So I felt like all the talks were really constructive in thinking about how to move forward. So we weren't just complaining about things. I think everyone suggested some avenues for what the future might look like. But there really was a difference in emphasis that I thought formed a spectrum. In my talk, I was really highlighting just changing your perspective on your current practice. Now, I don't think that would solve everything, but that's kind of what I was highlighting in that talk, just change kind of the way you're thinking about things. And Radhika extended that a little bit, going specifically to a research project. Jordan highlighted really expanding to new groups and bringing them in to the personality enterprise. And Monisha was more burn the whole thing down and let's see, where that takes us, right? So those are all different kind of models for what the future of the field could, or different ways of approaching making some change. And when I was reflecting on that a little bit, I was thinking that to address this question of, well, what do we do? I think it's helpful to step back a little bit and think more clearly about what the goal of personality science is. You know, what do we actually want to be doing as a field? And this came up during the discussion for Laura and Jordan's session a little bit. It was mentioned, but it wasn't really a focus. So I'm wondering, the question I'm interested in people talking about a little bit is, how do we see the goals of diversifying and changing practices, changing the way we think in relation to the goals of the enterprise of personality psychology or science as a whole of what we should be doing? How are those aligned or misaligned? And what is it we're even doing here? Much more concrete.
I mean, I think
Yeah.
that personality, I mean, we're all about individual differences. So I think we all care. I think we all care about the different perspectives and the like understanding how, you know, your culture shapes who you are and all of that. I just think it's really difficult to kind of know where to begin. So I have to also admit, thank you, Bill, for like admitting to being clueless. Like I felt a little bit clueless when listening to Monisha's talk. Like I didn't really understand how we could burn it all down. Like where do we begin? So I feel like Jordan had very specific suggestions, which makes sense about like, you know, going to places and trying to get people on your team who can help you. So that makes sense. And I thought Monisha's talk was very powerful and I completely agree with the need. But I don't know, I mean, I may have just not understood correctly, but I didn't clearly understand exactly how we can burn it all down and regrow it.
Oh, Yana, go for it.
Hi, I'm going to try to lower my hand now. I'm not used to this hand raising. I may have an answer for what Rodiko is just asking. When I was watching all of the talks, I was reminded a lot of my teaching. And I teach solely undergraduates. And so I'm not involved in directing a grad lab or really trying to get them to publish anything, just teaching them the basics. And when I teach them the basics, all these questions come up. Like they have questions, why do we use Likert scales? Like, do people understand what Likert scales mean? They've questioned, why don't we use more diverse samples? Why don't we investigate where people are from and their background and their culture? And so I think if we burn it all down, what we do is we reveal the foundation. And so we start with that foundation, and then we just make sure that we build the scaffolding on top of that foundation to help people grow in the way we want them to. And so that's where we get to the journals, the reviews, grad labs, the way your lab is teaching you how to do this stuff. Because what I think happens is that we get these undergrads who are questioning everything, and then we're like, oh, well, this is how it is. I mean, that was my experience in grad school, is that I came in being like, why don't we measure it this way? Why don't we do this? And people were just like, no, we do it this way. And so if we make sure that the scaffolding is not tearing down all that good basics and instead building it up, I think that might be the way to start.
That's great. Thanks, Yana. Totally agree, 100%. I say a similar thing in terms of open science practices. I often say, you know, for those who are not socialized and indoctrinated into the field, sort of many of the open science reforms that people are advocating for are seen as sort of the natural way to be doing science. This is the way we should be doing things. The question that they always ask me, my undergraduate students, why are you teaching? Why is this something notable? Isn't this what we already do? Sadly, that's not the case.
Okay, so that makes sense to me. So we know from the creativity literature as well that younger people are more like, we don't think so much in dogmatic ways. And I can see this in getting back to my baby, like he explores every new toy in completely creative ways that I would never think of because I assume the correct way of playing with the toy. And I see myself as being very lame for that. And he's much more creative and a better scientist than me, minus the expertise. Yeah, so that makes sense to me. So kind of allowing people, but then allowing people to build it up. But to do that, then it's the journal, because like you allow people to build it, the journals and the incentives and all of that, because you can allow people to build it up as much as they want, but they're not going to get anything published, and then they'll be weeded out of the field. So.
But that's another, I mean, I agree with all that. That's another thing that is just been sort of handed down to us. I have to be careful what I'm saying because I see Rich Lucas here in the corner, but why is JPSP a good journal? Somebody tell me why it's a good journal.
because when I was on the job market and applied for 60 jobs with 0 JPSPs, I didn't get any. And when I had 2 JPSPs, I got some. But that doesn't work always, though. It was probably just luck. So, yeah. So I don't know. Maybe that's part.
But I think that like in terms of this question for these issues, I think some of the models that we have from open science, I think also apply too, like where you just kind of start doing the other things. And then, you know, like the kind of the old fashioned journals kind of see what those, you know, what sort of new open science practices are being incorporated. And they say, oh, we're kind of losing papers or losing quality to these other things that are doing it a different way. And you know, I would be totally happy as editor of JPSP if someone kind of came up with something innovative that could serve as a model for things that we would have to then start to emulate. So, you know, I think that the way that publishing is working, I think that there's some opportunities for that. And again, in some of the new open access journals and these things that have a little bit, they are kind of starting from scratch in a lot of ways, and they can kind of do things better in a way that then can serve as a model for the existing things.
I might just chime in to say that it's probably not an accident that I got to burn it all down, because I've been in a very undergraduate focused role for the last 6 years of my career. But one of the things I think about with the career implications piece is that we should not let those of us who are kind of old dogs off the hook for learning new tricks. You know, it's not the job of students to kind of figure out how to pull things into it's also, you know, we have the power and the luxury to be doing that, and we ought to be thinking about it. And I'll admit, I mean, it's not easy, but it's I think really worthwhile.
I think one of the things that's useful to do is for those who are motivated to make change in this area is to be strategic about it, right? Think about how can I go about doing that? And that's something sort of, you know, one of the big spaces that I inhabit is broadly what's called ethnic minority psychology. And there's sort of two different models of that, really. There's folks who try to engage with mainstream developmental psychology, personality, whatever. And there are those who say, forget that, I'm just doing my work. I don't care what the mainstream says, right? And so people in this area, and this is true in a lot of other sub areas too, you sort of decide which avenue you want to take and which fights you want to fight, right? And I chose largely the former. I decided I'm going to try to get people to listen to the importance of thinking about these issues. So my colleagues say, why do you bother wasting your time? It's not going to do anything, you know, but that's sort of the path I've taken. And one thing that Kate McLean and I did early on and still do, I'm not going to take full credit for this, but in terms of trying to get developmental journals in particular to be open to narrative research, is connecting it to those models they already know about. Right? So making those bridges to what's already known and what's familiar and saying, here's how narrative research is related to this other quantitative identity work or whatever. And so you're making that bridge. And then you can, once you make that bridge, then you can burn that bridge down if you want and go down the other way because you've already established its relevance. And so I think, you know, that's worked pretty well, actually. And now it's not that hard to get narrative research published in those journals, but it used to be impossible, almost impossible. So, you know, I think and that was an intentional choice. That wasn't just like, oh, here's what we're doing. It just happened to work out. We were actually we're saying, here's how we can get people to pay attention to this. So that's just one strategy.
Hello, I'm an undergrad, I guess. So I don't know how valid my opinion is here, but I just was wondering, philosophically speaking, right? Because if you're willing to burn everything to the ground and take that approach where we're willing to go 180 and just kind of let go of it, doesn't that kind of bring a question to what the inherent like value of the fundamentals are? And I was thinking a more, because that basically takes away a bunch of research. So instead, another approach that might be more healthy would be more of a trimming the fat approach, where it's like seeking fundamentals and looking for what is there to be kind of taken that's concrete, rather than saying like, to hell with it.
Hi, Martin. I just wanted to chime in. I think if you check out the video by Dr. Jules Harrell from the first session, he offers a couple of, in part of that video, he talks about, particularly from the perspective of Black psychologists, like 4 different approaches to how to address your very question. So like for some people, the approach to burning it all down is like the way that they want to go. Some people just want to start totally fresh, and then some people do want to take your approach, which is I think a more kind of reconstructionist approach of trimming the fat and then just like trying to reform what we already have, recontextualize what we already have. So if this is something that you're interested in, I think there's a lot of literature in like philosophy of science and in like various disciplines kind of addressing psychology or like looking at psychology critically that do take that tactic. And there are kind of conversations out there about why some people might choose one approach versus others and why it might be good to have kind of all of these approaches happening at once so we can see what happens as they all kind of work in tandem.
Oh, okay. I just, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for telling me for that. I'm just curious then, it's just like, what are you telling people then? If you're kind of this, that, like, I feel like it just devalues the past if you're willing to like let go of stuff so immediately, but obviously that's not the case. I guess I lack a deeper understanding of this. Thank you.
Maybe I just want to say also that science does have to build on other science. And so, I don't know, maybe things are getting a little abstract and I think there's really valid criticisms to be made of so much work. But I'm sometimes struggling in this to understand exactly, is there some work we're still keeping? Like which work? I think that it's really helpful to be clear, here's the work we think we can improve on, and we want to improve on it this way. And here's some things we found. I know Sumaya is making some points about things being done in South Africa. I mean, we can always go to journals. There's regional journals all over the world that are publishing interesting and creative things. You know, we were hearing from the editor of Black Psychology at the last week. I mean, we can go to other journals, things that are maybe not getting the biggest mainstream voice, and build on those things. And then we're not throwing everything out, and we are doing science. We're building on something, and maybe, you know, we are trying to publish in JPSP or something, but we can bring in citations. We can talk about the work that other people are doing and still be building on something. We don't have to, I don't know. I can't quite even understand the concept of burning everything down, because then how is that even science anymore? Or maybe I'm just reacting to the extremeness of how that is in some ways being put, even though I think that I am actually also someone who wants to dump lots of things and then highlight some things that have been, you know, underrepresented.
Yeah, thanks for saying that, Amber. And Manisha put an important comment in the chat that I'm the one who said that her talk was burning it down. She didn't say anything about burning anything down. That was me being cheeky about sort of the subtext, I thought, of the talk. So just good.
My bad. I totally fall.
No, that's yeah.
No, yeah,
that's my fault.
How would you have, you know, been certain about that? And I do think it's funny, because when we're speaking amongst ourselves, we may like use, you know, and I can say this just definitely for Moyen and myself and some of our colleagues, we can be loose with words for fun in ways that that then may have more problematic implications when they go broader.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so Martin, actually, I'm really grateful to you for posing the question, because it actually highlighted that space that we're working within, like layered little subcultures here of people who know each other at varying levels and interpret phrases based on their knowledge. And I think it was actually pretty important to bring that sensibility into the conversation.
Yeah, no, I just love avoiding those kinds of rabbit holes. Me and my friends have these philosophical conversations when we start asking such like vague questions. I feel like they kind of lose their constructive value. So I just want to like, I felt like we were going there, but obviously I see what you're saying. Thank you.
Sean, just 1 second, I want to say one thing and we'll go to your question about the past and building on the past. I guess the way that I've shifted my way of thinking is I used to always believe any study until I had reason not to, right? That was my general default. If I come across an article, I believe this is probably an accurate representation or whatever it is they're doing until I see any evidence to suggest I shouldn't. I've completely shifted that the other way around. That my default is that this is not, I have reason to be skeptical and doubt this unless I see evidence to the contrary. And that's true for studies from the past and studies going forward. So I think it's kind of just a reshift in terms of just being a little bit more skeptical and having a higher threshold for evidence. Yeah, Sean, go ahead.
Yeah, one thing I guess I've been thinking when we did all this is that we're kind of indoctrinated early with statistical methods and research methods. And one of the things I started to think about is that we adapt our questions to the methods and statistics that we know. And then everybody is sort of indoctrinated in these, and then we answer the questions that we already have answers for without ever learning how to find a new way to answer questions. And I kind of think about that a lot early in our pedagogy, because I'm a teacher primarily, how we might change that.
I'll just say I agree 100% with that. I think it's a major problem. And we absolutely do that, both even just within quantitative focused research, not even willing to go to qualitative. Our methods constrain our questions in major ways.
Thank you everyone for your meaningful responses. You guys can carry on for my question now. I appreciate it.
Yeah, just building a little bit off of what John just added in the chat as well. I think some of the biggest potential is going to be getting those fresh perspectives, or at least a little bit different perspectives, folks who are going to be interested in similar topics and similar kind of broad domains, perhaps human behavior or even personality, but who are coming from different traditions, different ways of thinking about the possible research toolkit and methods. I think the ongoing emphasis, and we've seen for a few years now, maybe many years now, that there's been a push, very broadly speaking, for more interdisciplinary teams and approaches where it makes sense, where it's feasible, and continuing to try to work pretty closely with colleagues in other behavioral or other human sciences, so on and so forth, who are going to usually see things a little bit different, usually use a different set of methods to maybe get at what could end up being a comparable question, or maybe a question they've tailored in a certain way up to this point. I think would be one of the nice ways to sort of nudge ourselves and get ourselves out of that comfort zone. So we're starting to hear more about, again, getting some of that awareness, hearing more about different approaches, different possibilities, and ways that we don't have to necessarily change our question that we initially started off with thinking, oh, we don't have a great way of throwing this in a model. We don't have a great way of capturing this with some existing sets of questionnaires, but thinking about how others are also bringing some of those different tools. That could be really one really promising way of pushing the boundaries a little bit for ourselves.
Oh, Bora has a question.
Yeah, hi. So I'm from a completely different field altogether. So it's been really interesting to hear everyone speak about diversity and positionality. And to a certain extent, I've interpreted the conversation about, it's about the illusion of scientific detachment and objectivity, and this positive model of personality science, and whether that can make room for the researchers' personalities themselves affecting how they carry out their research. And it's really interesting hearing Jordan Booker speak, because one of the things that I've thought a lot about is the inclusion of participants and people from the communities where this kind of research takes place, not just only during the data collection phase, but in the interpretation and analyses. So ways to generate feedback about the way you do science by reaching out to the communities that you're researching as a person that has a different positionality. And I was wondering whether this is something that happens at all in personality science and everyone's thoughts on this.
So I'll just follow up, since it's a little bit from some of the things I was briefly mentioning. I've had some good colleagues. I haven't had as many opportunities yet, though. I've done some other forms of community engagement that sort of brings some of the findings from recent work back to community members. But as far as folks who have been in some of my research projects directly following up with those individuals longer term, other than sharing some of the broader findings, I haven't had as many opportunities yet, or haven't thought of as many creative forums yet. But I know that there are a number of folks, sometimes a little bit beyond personality science, who are doing that a little bit better. Certainly worth following up with. But there might be others in the sort of group today who might have some additional sort of successes or opportunities to reach back out to participants or sort of just relevant community stakeholders if they've got any insights.
Cora, have you done this yourself, actually? Because I know you've worked with some really interesting populations.
It was a vision. Yeah, I haven't been able to implement it, but it's a guiding vision. I think I know you and I had this discussion. I tried to, and I use this metaphor of, I found myself in a situation where I was asking someone to drive when they couldn't drive, and it was disempowering, even though my intention was very much to empower and to, so I think there's, and perhaps it's a bit of an idealistic vision. I think there are a lot of complexities when it comes to actually implementing that. But I'm curious to know if other researchers in this virtual space have experienced trying to do it as well.
As Kelsey put in the chat, Joanne has done some, she had to leave here, but she's done some interesting work. But unfortunately, we are out of time. I have to wrap this up. We could talk about this quite a bit more. But we need, people need a break before the next session, right? Go stretch it out. So I appreciate everyone's thoughtful engagement and participation. I thought this was a nice discussion. I guess my take home message, hopefully for everybody, is just to reflect more on what you're doing. You know, as I said, why is JPSP a good journal? It's a question you should ask yourself, right? Why do I have negative feelings about qualitative methods? You know, where does that come from, right? And I think those aren't the kinds of positions that we reflect on very frequently, because we have largely just been socialized that this is how we do things, right? And so that's kind of our maybe a very small way to burn it down is, you know, really reflect on your own practices, positions, beliefs, what have you, and hopefully then that can lead to some positive changes in what you're doing. So thanks everyone. Have a good one. Come to the roundtable, which is in like an hour, I think, right? We'll chat more about these things. So hope to see you there.